Polly's been writing lyrics with me way back to the Division Bell, Pink Floyd album, 94. But Romany was singing along, Leonard Cohen songs, joining in. But gradually, they all pulled out.
By the time David Gilmour walked onto the stage again in 2024, something about him felt different even before he touched the guitar. The crowd still roared the same way. Thousands of people stood the second the lights dimmed. Some held old Pink Floyd vinyl records against their chest like family photographs. Others looked at him with the kind of expression people usually reserve for someone they never thought they would see again. But David no longer carried himself like a rock star. He moved carefully now, slower than before. His silver hair caught the pale light while his face showed the quiet exhaustion of a man who had lived long enough to outlast almost everybody around him. And maybe that is the real tragedy of David Gilmour. Not scandal, not addiction, not money, but survival. At 80 years old, David Gilmour has become something very few musicians ever experience. He is one of the final living echoes of an era that no longer exists. Syd Barrett is gone. Richard Wright is gone. So many voices connected to that world disappeared into illness, distance, bitterness, or death. Even Pink Floyd itself feels less like a living band today, and more like the memory of a civilization buried beneath time. And somehow, David remains standing in the middle of the ruins. In recent interviews surrounding his album Luck and Strange, Gilmour openly admitted that aging and mortality had shaped the emotional core of the record. His wife, Polly Sampson, explained that many of the songs were written from the perspective of growing older and slowly confronting the passage of time. Louder sound, calm, and when you listen carefully to the album, you can hear it. Not fear, exactly. Something quieter than fear. The sound of a man looking backward more than forward. David Gilmour never belonged to the loud side of rock music. He was never the wild one destroying hotel rooms or stumbling drunk into cameras. While other musicians chased chaos as if it were proof of greatness, David always seemed to drift in the opposite direction, toward silence, toward distance, toward privacy. That became even more noticeable as he grew older. There are moments now during interviews where he pauses before answering simple questions, almost as though memories arrive heavier than words. In one recent conversation, he reflected on how strange it feels watching entire chapters of life slowly disappear while you continue moving forward. The Guardian, calm. For millions of people, David Gilmour's guitar was never just music. It became attached to life itself, to divorces, to funerals, to lonely drives at night, to old friendships, to memories of people no longer alive. And maybe that is why audiences react so emotionally when they see him now. They are not simply looking at a legendary guitarist. They are looking at the sound of their own youth still breathing in front of them. The strange thing is that David's music always carried sadness, even during the years when Pink Floyd ruled the world. His solos never sounded rushed or triumphant. Every note seemed suspended in reflection, almost like somebody quietly mourning something they could never fully explain. Especially in songs like Comfortably Numb, High Hopes, or Shine on You, Crazy Diamond. The guitar does not scream in those songs. It remembers. That emotional weight became even stronger after the death of Richard Wright in 2008. Wright had been one of David's closest musical companions for decades, and people close to the band noticed a change in him afterward. He became more withdrawn, more reflective, less interested in reliving Pink Floyd's past publicly. In later interviews, Gilmour admitted that losing Wright deeply affected him because he viewed Rick not only as a bandmate, but as an essential emotional part of Pink Floyd itself. Louder sound. Calm. Age changes people, but loss changes them differently. And perhaps nobody understands that better than David Gilmour now, because behind the sold-out arenas, behind the history, behind one of the most recognizable guitar sounds ever recorded, there is still a quiet man from Cambridge who learned very early in life how to hide inside silence instead of speaking openly about pain. Long before Pink Floyd, long before fame, long before the world knew his name. David Gilmour was simply a lonely boy trying to find somewhere his emotions could exist safely. And eventually, he found that place inside a guitar. David Gilmour was born on March 6, 1946, in Cambridge, England, a city filled with professors, scholars, and quiet intellectual ambition. It was the kind of place where conversations about science and literature floated through dinner tables as naturally as weather reports. His father, Douglas Gilmour, was a respected lecturer in zoology at Cambridge University. His mother, Sylvia, worked as a film editor and journalist connected to the BBC. From the outside, the family appeared stable, educated, and fortunate compared to much of post-war Britain. But emotional warmth is not always guaranteed inside intelligent homes. Years later, David spoke carefully about his childhood, never bitter, never dramatic, yet always carrying a subtle distance when discussing family life. His parents worked constantly. They provided structure and opportunity, but affection often seemed secondary to responsibility. Nobody shouted. Nobody hit him. Nobody abandoned him. Still, David grew up feeling emotionally alone more often than not. That feeling shaped almost everything he became later. As a child, he spent enormous amounts of time by himself, wandering through Cambridge streets, listening to records, reading books, and quietly observing people from a distance instead of joining them. Teachers described him as bright but detached. Friends remembered him as gentle yet difficult to fully know. Even early on, David seemed more comfortable inside his own thoughts than inside crowds. And perhaps that is why music reached him so deeply. At around age 13, he received his first guitar. There were no formal lessons, no strict training. David taught himself mostly by listening to records repeatedly and copying what he heard by instinct. American blues musicians fascinated him immediately. Muddy Waters, Lead Belly, B.B. King. Their music carried pain without needing explanation. That mattered to him, because David himself rarely explained emotion directly. He felt things quietly, deeply, privately, and the guitar became the first place where those emotions could exist openly without forcing him to speak. Unlike many famous guitarists, David never approached music like an athlete chasing speed or technical dominance. Even as a teenager, he focused more on feeling than performance. A single sustained note interested him more than showing off complicated technique. That emotional style would later become one of the most recognizable sounds in music history. Around this same period, another young man from Cambridge began drifting into David's life, Syd Barrett. If David was restrained, Syd was explosive, charismatic, artistic, magnetic. People naturally gathered around Syd the second he entered a room. He possessed imagination that seemed almost limitless, mixed with unpredictability that made him impossible to ignore. David admired him enormously. Almost everybody did. The two connected through music, art, and endless conversations, wandering around Cambridge late at night discussing poetry, blues records, surrealism, and the strange new underground music scene beginning to emerge in London during the 1960s. But emotionally, they were opposites. David hid emotion beneath control. Syd poured emotion directly into the world without protection. At the time, neither of them understood how dangerous that difference would eventually become. During the mid-1960s, David drifted through small bands and temporary musical projects without much urgency about success. He traveled through France and Spain with friends, busking on streets and surviving with almost no money. Some nights they slept outdoors, other nights inside cheap hostels or abandoned buildings. According to stories David later shared, there were periods when they lived so poorly they barely had enough money for food. Yet strangely, those years never sounded traumatic when he described them. If anything, he remembered them with a kind of bittersweet affection. There was freedom in having nothing, no expectations, no pressure, no spotlight. At that point, David still did not look like somebody destined for global fame. He was simply another young musician carrying a guitar through Europe, searching for direction without knowing exactly what he wanted to become. Meanwhile, back in London, Syd Barrett's band, Pink Floyd, had started attracting serious attention inside the psychedelic underground scene. Their concerts became famous for strange visuals, experimental soundscapes, and Sid's increasingly surreal songwriting. For a brief moment, it looked as though Syd Barrett might become one of the defining creative voices of his generation. Then the rumors started. Friends whispered that Syd was changing, forgetting conversations, staring blankly into space during rehearsals, losing focus mid-performance. Some blamed LSD immediately. Others believed something deeper was happening psychologically long before the drugs entered his life. The exact truth remains unclear even today. But according to people close to the band, Barrett's mental state deteriorated rapidly during 1967. Far Out magazine, Come UK. At first, David did not fully understand how serious the situation had become. None of them did. But very soon, the quiet boy who spent most of his life avoiding the spotlight would suddenly find himself carrying the emotional weight of replacing his closest friend. And that burden would follow him forever. By early 1968, Pink Floyd was already becoming one of the most fascinating bands in Britain. Their concerts felt less like ordinary performances and more like strange psychological experiences. Lights pulsed across the walls while audiences stood hypnotized inside clouds of smoke and noise. At the center stood Syd Barrett, smiling one moment, completely detached the next, and David Gilmour watched his friend slowly disappear in front of everybody. Not physically at first, mentally. There were nights when Syd barely played at all. Other nights, he stood frozen on stage, staring into nothing while the rest of the band tried desperately to continue around him. Conversations became fragmented. His focus drifted away without warning. Friends later admitted they often could not tell whether Syd understood what was happening around him anymore. LSD use had become heavy during this period, though many people close to Barrett later believed drugs alone could not explain the collapse. According to several former friends and associates, Syd already showed signs of emotional instability before psychedelic use intensified everything dramatically. Rolling Stone. Calm. For David, the situation became deeply personal very quickly. Because Syd was not simply a fellow musician, he was his friend from Cambridge. The bright, fearless young man who once seemed capable of turning imagination itself into music. When Pink Floyd finally invited David to join the band officially, the original plan was not necessarily to replace Syd entirely. At first, they hoped David could support live performances while Barrett recovered. Another guitarist, another singer, somebody to stabilize the situation temporarily. But deep down, everyone already sensed reality closing in. Syd Barrett was slipping away. One moment from that period remained burned into David's memory for the rest of his life. The band was driving to a concert when somebody inside the car asked a simple question. Should we pick Syd up? And after a pause, someone quietly answered, no. The car kept driving. No confrontation, no final goodbye, no dramatic ending, just silence. Years later, David still spoke about Syd with visible sadness rather than anger. That may be one reason audiences always connected so strongly with his playing afterward. There was grief buried inside it. Not theatrical grief, real grief, the kind that never fully leaves. Because unlike many rock bands destroyed by ego or money, Pink Floyd's first fracture came from helplessness. They could not save someone they loved, and David especially seemed haunted by that reality. After Syd officially left the band in 1968, David suddenly found himself standing inside a role nobody truly wanted to inherit. Fans still viewed Barrett as the soul of Pink Floyd. Critics constantly compared everything David played against Syd's ghost. But instead of trying to imitate him or compete with his memory, David moved in the opposite direction musically. Where Syd created chaos, David created atmosphere. Where Syd exploded emotionally outward, David turned inward. That shift slowly transformed Pink Floyd itself. Albums like A Saucer Full of Secrets, Metal, and eventually The Dark Side of the Moon pushed the band away from psychedelic unpredictability toward something deeper, slower, and more emotionally cinematic. And David's guitar became central to that evolution, especially during songs like Echoes, where his playing no longer sounded like ordinary rock music. It sounded reflective, lonely, almost wounded, as though every note carried memory attached to it. Then came 1975, and the moment that permanently scarred everybody involved. Pink Floyd was recording Wish You Were Here, an album heavily inspired by Syd Barrett himself. The entire project revolved around absence, loss, disconnection, and the emotional damage fame leaves behind, particularly Shine on You Crazy Diamond. Then one afternoon, during sessions at Abbey Road Studios, Syd unexpectedly walked into the room. At first, almost nobody recognized him. He had shaved his head completely. His eyebrows were gone. He had gained significant weight. Friends later described him as emotionally distant and difficult to follow in conversation. Roger Waters reportedly broke down crying after realizing who stood before them. David later admitted the entire experience felt deeply unsettling because the man standing there barely resembled the friend they remembered from Cambridge. BBC.com. Imagine writing songs mourning somebody emotionally, only for them to suddenly appear alive in front of you like a ghost. That moment never truly left David Gilmour, and maybe it explains why his music always carried such unusual sadness afterward. Because Syd Barrett became more than memory. He became a warning, the terrifying realization that brilliance does not protect people from collapse. That sensitivity sometimes destroys the very people capable of creating beauty. And perhaps David understood that danger more personally than audiences realized, because emotionally, he was fragile too. The difference was that David learned early in life how to bury pain beneath control. Syd never could. As Pink Floyd entered the biggest years of its career during the 1970s, David carried that understanding silently through every performance, every recording session, every solo, especially during Shine on You Crazy Diamond. That song was never simply about Syd Barrett. It was about mourning somebody while they were still alive, and the tragedy was only beginning. By the mid-1970s, Pink Floyd had become something far bigger than a normal rock band. They were everywhere. Massive arena tours across America, platinum records, endless interviews, private planes, critics calling them visionaries while audiences treated concerts almost like spiritual experiences instead of ordinary entertainment. And inside all that success, David Gilmour was becoming increasingly exhausted. Not physically at first, emotionally. Because while the public saw Pink Floyd as a united creative force, the atmosphere inside the band had already started changing dramatically. Roger Waters grew more controlling with every album. His ideas became darker, more political, more aggressive. He wanted total authority over the direction of the music. David disagreed more often than people realized, not because he lacked ambition, because he still believed music needed emotion, not only concepts. That difference slowly turned into tension. Then tension became distance, and eventually distance became war. The recording sessions for The Wall in 1979 were especially difficult. According to multiple interviews given years later by band members and producers, the atmosphere inside the studio became cold, hostile, and emotionally draining. Ultimate, classic rock, calm. Arguments happened constantly. At times, they barely communicated directly. David later admitted he found much of the process miserable, and perhaps nothing represented that conflict more clearly than Comfortably Numb. Roger Waters originally imagined the song one way. David heard it completely differently. They argued intensely about arrangements, emotional tone, and structure. Thank God they did. Because what emerged became one of the most emotional recordings in rock history. David's guitar solo on Comfortably Numb no longer feels like performance even today. It feels like emotional release after years of pressure finally escaping through sound. Millions of listeners connected to that solo because it carried something painfully human inside it. Exhaustion, isolation, numbness. The strange feeling of being emotionally detached from your own life. And perhaps David understood those emotions better than audiences realized. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Cocaine use became common inside the rock world. David later acknowledged he struggled with drug use during that era, particularly cocaine, describing it as part of a destructive lifestyle surrounding fame and endless studio pressure. Fairut magazine, Co. UKA. Unlike many musicians, he rarely spoke about it dramatically. No sensational stories, no public meltdowns, but that silence itself says something. David always hid suffering quietly. People close to the band noticed another change, too. The more successful Pink Floyd became, the more withdrawn David seemed away from the stage. He preferred isolation to celebrity culture, boats instead of parties, countryside homes instead of Hollywood attention, long periods away from cameras whenever possible. Fame never appeared natural on him. It looked heavy, as if the entire machine surrounding Pink Floyd demanded pieces of his personality he did not want to give away. Then came one of the deepest fractures inside the band. Richard Wright. Rick had always been emotionally close to David because they approached music similarly. Both valued atmosphere, feeling, and subtlety over domination or ego. Their musical connection shaped much of Pink Floyd's emotional identity. But during The Wall, Roger Waters pushed Wright out of the band almost entirely. For David, that crossed a line. Years later, Gilmour openly admitted he never fully forgave what happened to Rick during that period. He described Wright as essential to the emotional soul of Pink Floyd itself. Louder sound. And underneath all these creative conflicts sat a sadder truth. None of them were happy anymore. Success had turned Pink Floyd into an empire. Empires consume people eventually. By 1985, Roger Waters officially left the band and publicly declared Pink Floyd finished forever. Then came lawsuits, public bitterness, endless arguments over ownership, legacy, and identity. For David, the legal battle became emotionally exhausting beyond words. Not because he wanted control, because he refused to let the music die completely. Friends later described him during that era as emotionally drained but quietly determined, publicly calm, privately overwhelmed. That became David's pattern throughout life. Carry pain privately, keep moving publicly. Eventually, he continued Pink Floyd without Waters through albums like A Momentary Lapse of Reason and The Division Bell. Commercially, the band remained enormous, stadiums still filled, fans still came. But something inside David had changed permanently by then, because surviving success is not the same as finding peace. And by the late 1980s, David Gilmour already looked less like a triumphant rock legend and more like a man carrying decades of emotional weight nobody around him fully understood. Then life brought him something unexpected. Not another war, not another stage, something quieter. Love. And for the first time in many years, David slowly began finding pieces of himself again. By the early 1990s, David Gilmour looked like a man who had spent too many years emotionally surviving instead of truly living. Pink Floyd still existed. The tours remained enormous. Money was no longer something he ever needed to worry about again. But behind the success sat a growing exhaustion that people close to him quietly recognized. He had spent decades inside conflict, decades carrying grief connected to Syd Barrett, decades trapped between artistic pressure, lawsuits, fame, and endless public expectations. And somewhere along the way, David began wanting something much simpler than greatness: peace. His first marriage, to American model Ginger Gilmour, had slowly collapsed under the weight of touring, distance, and emotional strain. The separation happened quietly during the early 1990s without public scandal or dramatic accusations. That alone says something about David Gilmour. Even heartbreak in his life happened privately. No interviews attacking each other, no tabloid chaos. Just two people drifting apart after years spent trying to survive the pressure surrounding one of the biggest bands in music history. Then came Polly Sampson. And people close to David noticed the difference almost immediately. Polly was intelligent, calm, emotionally direct in ways David himself often struggled to be. A writer and journalist, she understood language deeply, which became important because David had always communicated more easily through music than conversation. Over time, Polly became more than his partner. She became emotional stability, creative partnership, family, home. In later years, David openly admitted how important she became not only personally but artistically. Polly eventually co-wrote lyrics across much of his later solo work, including On an Island, Rattle That Lock, and Luck and Strange, Guitar World Calm. And perhaps for the first time in his life, David stopped running emotionally. Their home life moved far away from the chaos people usually associate with rock legends. They settled into quieter rhythms, family dinners, writing, boats, long walks in the countryside, studio sessions at home instead of giant commercial spaces surrounded by executives and deadlines. David seemed relieved by ordinary life. That matters, because many people spend decades chasing fame only to realize too late they actually wanted normality all along. And David increasingly looked like one of those people. During the 2000s and 2010s, his solo albums carried a very different emotional tone than classic Pink Floyd records. The anger faded. The paranoia softened. What remained was reflection, especially on an Island. That album does not sound like a man trying to dominate culture anymore. It sounds like somebody standing quietly at the edge of life, finally breathing slower after surviving years of emotional noise. And audiences felt that immediately. One of the most revealing things about David Gilmour is that he never truly tried to remain young publicly. Unlike many aging rock stars desperately clinging to old images, David allowed time to appear naturally on him. Gray hair, slower movement, a softer voice. Even his performances changed emotionally. Older David Gilmour concerts feel less like rock shows and more like memory gatherings. People arrive carrying entire lifetimes attached to the music. And David knows it. In 2019, he shocked many fans by auctioning over 120 guitars from his personal collection, including the legendary Black Strat used on some of Pink Floyd's most famous recordings. The auction raised more than $21 million, all donated toward climate and environmental charities. Christie's calm. His explanation afterward was simple. I don't need these guitars to sit in storage. That sentence revealed something profound about him. David never seemed emotionally attached to fame itself. Not really. The music mattered. The memories mattered. People mattered. But celebrity never fully became part of his identity. Then came 2023, and suddenly old wounds inside the Pink Floyd world exploded publicly again. Roger Waters made controversial political remarks that triggered enormous backlash internationally. Polly Sampson publicly criticized him online, calling him anti-Semitic and a Putin apologist. The situation immediately became global entertainment news. People wondered whether David would stay silent. He didn't. With one short public statement, he supported Polly completely. I stand by every word my wife has said. Independent, co-UK, no long speech, no dramatic interview, just certainty. And perhaps that moment revealed the older David Gilmour more clearly than anything else. He no longer seemed interested in preserving mythology, only protecting the life he built away from the noise. Because by then, age had changed his priorities completely. The spotlight mattered less. Peace mattered more. And as he entered his late 70s, approaching 80 years old, David increasingly began sounding like a man aware that time itself was becoming fragile. Not in panic, in acceptance, which may explain why his later music carries such unusual emotional honesty. It sounds like somebody looking backward at an entire lifetime and quietly realizing how quickly it all disappeared.